slides. So we've been doing these 30-minute bite-sized programs, and we've been taking, and as many of you know, there's over 130 different types of dementias. We've been taking the most common ones, and we've made these 30-minute programs. Next week, we're doing understanding alcohol and drug-induced dementia. So please join us for that one. And then we'll be doing Parkinson's dementia, and we're just working our way through. We've already done Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, and
Lewy body dementia.
Lewy body dementia. And those are recorded. And are they available now, Jamie?
Yes, they are on YouTube, our YouTube channel.
Our YouTube channel. So if you missed those, and you can also direct other people there as well. All right, let's get going. So introduction to frontotemporal disorders. So many times you'll hear that term FTD, and I'm actually got an entire slide because there are so many terms that fall under frontotemporal disorders because there's several of them. But what are they exactly? So what this is doing is it's naming a region of the brain. If you're familiar with the brain, this particular type of dementia is going to either be cell loss where the cells are dying in this frontal area, which is right here behind the forehead, or the temporal lobes, which are the areas behind the ears. So what's happening with all of the dementias, we know that the brain cells are actually dying. So we are having atrophy of the brain. The brain is beginning to shrink. So in someone who has a frontotemporal disorder, and a little bit different from Alzheimer's, where Alzheimer's may be starting to shrink more at a rate where the entire brain is shrinking. In the frontotemporal disorders, it's pulling back more from that frontotemporal area at a quicker rate. Here's the other thing. If you look at that third bullet point, you're going to see something missing from this list. It tends to affect personality, behavior, language, emotions, planning and sequencing, prioritizing and multitasking and movement first. You noticed a word was missing. Memory wasn't on that list. So people who aren't familiar with this disease, and Lewy body also, when we talked about Lewy body, they can present with no memory loss, but they are still a dementia. So it can present with no memory loss because typically it presents with those things first. So here are some of the terms. And again, this is going to be a fast program, and it may start sounding like I'm talking in another language, but I wanted to make sure and have a slide that was specific to these, and you're going to get these slides. So when you see it, and it's written like that with the lowercase bv and then the uppercase FTD, that is behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. It is the most common type of frontotemporal dementia, and it is responsible for about half of all of the cases of frontotemporal dementia. This is what is also referred to as FTD, where you will hear people just call it FTD for short. We used to use the term Pick's disease, and occasionally you'll still get a doctor that will say Pick's disease, and there's a reason they may still say Pick's disease, and that's the very next bullet point, because they actually can see something called, just like we use that term Lewy bodies, that's named after a person whose last name was Lewy, and they saw these foreign bodies on the brain, and so they started calling them Lewy bodies. This is named after a physician whose last name was Pick, and it is another type of foreign body on the brain, and they actually call them Pick bodies. So some people who have the behavioral variant FTD have the Pick bodies, and some don't have the Pick bodies. So where they used to say that everything that was Pick's disease was that FTD, now they know, and they find this out at autopsy. Normally that's where they see it, as if somebody has an autopsy, whether they did or they did not have those Pick bodies on the brain. There's also FTLD, frontotemporal lobar degeneration. You'll also hear this called frontotemporal disorders, frontotemporal degenerations, or frontal lobe disorders. And that's just terms, many terms, that refers to changes in the behavior and thinking because there's damages to this frontotemporal part of the brain. So you may hear physicians using any of these terms, but just so that you can kind of, are they the same? Are they different? So that FTLD is not a single brain disease. It's a family of related diseases. So all of the frontotemporal disorders are a form of dementia. So just as a review, dementia is that big umbrella term. Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia. And then we have vascular dementia, we have Lewy body dementia, we have frontotemporal dementia, and then we've got these frontotemporal disorders. It's like we could have another umbrella under the umbrella. We've got Parkinson's, there's over 130 different types of dementia. So when someone says, my loved one has dementia, we would say, what type? Just like our loved one has cancer, what kind of cancer? So dementia is just that umbrella term. Now, here's the thing with FTD. We typically see it in people younger than the age of 65. So we have an earlier onset. But look at this first bullet point. According to the National Institutes of Health, FTD is the second most common dementia after early onset Alzheimer's in people younger than 65. 60% of people with FTD are diagnosed between 45 and 64. And I found some statistics yesterday that said it can show up as young as in a person's 20s. It can be diagnosed from the 20s into the 80s, is what I found. Life expectancy is about 7 years, but of course, all dementias are a very individualized disease. You'll see some people live for 2 years and some people live for 15 years. So the average is about 7. It is progressive, it is terminal, just like all of the other dementias. And another thing that's a little bit different about the FTD is in the earlier stages, they may just have one symptom. This is a very hard dementia to get diagnosed. And we're going to talk about that. It usually, I don't know that I've ever met anyone who ended up with an FTD diagnosis that they got it the first time because it looks like so many other things. And because of the age, you can imagine if someone goes in their 20s, 30s, 40s with some of these symptoms, dementia is not going to be the first thing that the physician is going to think. So there's no cure, there's no treatments that help slow or stop the progression of the disease. What they do is they treat the symptoms. So what are the symptoms? And there are a lot of symptoms that go with FTD. And again, as we go through these symptoms, I want you to just be thinking about what, if somebody presents this way, they come in with some of these things, what they might get diagnosed with. Here's some of the number one thing. We see this very often, inappropriate social behaviors. So laughing out loud at a funeral, having a really difficult time reading social signs. I had someone one time come to my door. I was talking on the phone and I just put my finger up, you know how we go like, give me just a minute. And they came and stood right as close as they could get to me without touching me. So that's not knowing how to read a social sign, those type things. Saying inappropriate things in public places. Having a really hard time making decisions because they focus on these really insignificant details and are ignoring these other facts. I had a woman who went into Brahms, got a gallon of milk and laid down a quarter and said, I paid them $25. It was 25 cents. And she thought a gallon of milk cost $25. That kind of confusion. But she was still living alone. But she was making that kind of a mistake. She was still driving. But she thought a gallon of milk cost $25 and that a quarter was $25. Engaging in purposeless activities. Doing things that you're not really understanding. Why are you doing this and why are you doing it over and over again? Having a hard time linking words together, starting to leave out words in sentences, and then having motor difficulties, gait difficulties, issues with arms and legs, neuromuscular weaknesses. Struggling to understand not only the spoken word, but also the written word, having a hard time writing. An interesting phenomenon that you'll see a lot of times with people with any of the frontotemporal disorders is you may ask them, and this was an example that I found, where a woman was asked to spell the word all, A-L-L, and she couldn't, but she could write the word alligator. So she could write out alligator, but she couldn't write all. Here's some more symptoms. Problems with executive functioning. Notice we haven't said anything about memory yet. Executive functioning, just stored up here, that's that planning and the sequence. What do I do first? What's the next step? What do I do next? So that can really come into effect with our personal hygiene. You know, what are the steps I take getting ready in the morning? Thinking through the steps of a recipe, thinking through the steps of driving the car, thinking through the steps of making this computer work or that phone work or that remote control work. And then they're self-monitoring, being able to self-regulate, starting to have repetition. Another thing you'll see many times with someone with FTD is gorging on starchy foods and reaching over and taking other people's foods. Because they lose that regulation of I'm full and will just eat and eat and eat until they're sick sometimes. And that falls also with impulse control, because part of that is being able to control an impulse to stop eating, or this being able to resist touching another object. It's like, don't touch that, the wet paint sign kind of thing. They'll do it. It's losing impulse control. Lack of interest, drive, or initiative. And here's even more. Problems recognizing their own emotions in themselves and others. That's why I thought this picture was perfect. They are not only they cannot recognize what's going on in themselves, and they cannot recognize what's going on in others. So as families, what I'll hear from families is, it's like they don't even care anymore. Well, if they can't recognize it in themselves, they can't recognize it in you either. They lose the ability to understand a dangerous situation, and they may do something like reach down to pick up a snake, or reach to grab a knife and they're getting it by the part that's sharp, by the blade, or stick their hand down in boiling water. It's like not recognizing that's dangerous, even if you tell them that that's dangerous. They may have a flat affect or flat emotions, or they may have exaggerated emotions. They may have those emotions where they laugh or cry at inappropriate times. Abnormal postures of the body is just when they start to get stiff or rigid. Gait disorders, a tremor, and clumsiness. And some of you may be starting to hear in your head Parkinson's, where they might get misdiagnosed as Parkinson's because they can present as Parkinson's. So what causes this? Where with Alzheimer's disease, we know that they are actually have a plaque that is starting to grow on the brain. What we're seeing with the FTDs, the disorders, the frontotemporal disorders, is that up to 40% of the time, it's genetics and it is gene mutations. So this is one of the dementias that we do tend to see more in families. But again, that's only 40% of the time. So I went through and I found, and you can see by looking at this, what in the world, but this is the name of genes, or all these letters and numbers that are on here. But one of the most common ones we see, and you may be familiar with that word tau, because the tau protein comes into play with Alzheimer's disease. But what happens with these frontotemporal, the mutation causes the tangles inside. So we all have this tau protein, but what happens is it leads to brain deterioration, and it's usually found in the bvFTD, the behavioral variant frontotemporal dementias. This is where we normally see the mutations with that tau gene. Then there's the PGRN gene, which is a mutation which leads to a low production of a protein. And this is just information that I found that they're now starting to figure out what causes it. What they haven't figured out is, how do we stop it? How do we stop these mutations from happening? This is pretty good research, though, to have found out what causes it. When I started working in this field, they didn't even know this. This is all in the big scheme of science. This is pretty new information. So there's 3 types of frontotemporal disorders, and even underneath those, there's some subtypes. So we've talked about the bvFTD, behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, and we're going to deep dive into each of these very quickly. Characterized by the personality changes, behavior changes, emotions, and judgment. Sometimes you also see them written this other way, because it can be TVFTD, If they just have damage and they're able to see that it's just in the temporal, or it can be bvFTD if it's just in the frontal. Then there's primary progressive aphasia, and this is a progressive language decline. They usually will present with changes in language and communications first. So these people many times get misdiagnosed as having had a stroke because they're starting to have difficulty with their language first. So it can be speaking, understanding, reading, writing. Most people who have the primary progressive aphasia are diagnosed between 45 and 65. Then we have the corticobasal syndrome, supranuclear palsy, and I've got to make sure I'm saying these, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I think that's right. This is the ones that present as a progressive motor decline. And this is where they will present with physical movement issues. So again, those many times will get misdiagnosed, or they'll first start thinking that it's Parkinson's. So first, let's look kind of deep dive for just a minute into this bvFTD. The most common, this is the one that I found information that says it can be diagnosed as early as a person in their 20s and as late as in their 80s. It involves changes to personality first, behavior and judgment. This is the one where we see that inappropriate and impulsive social behaviors that will change, not recognizing that they're doing anything offensive, not having any consideration for other people and their feelings, having that flat affect. Their memory is generally intact for quite some time. The next one, PPA, primary progressive aphasia, a little bit more information on it. So it normally will present with changes in reading, writing, speaking, and understanding. And it has some fascinating, the three types of PPA, because if you look at it, you've got to get to somebody who specializes in this to really get a good diagnosis. Because many times you start talking to even professionals in the field, and this just, it gets a little bit too deep. If this isn't their field, then they may not be familiar with all, they may have heard of them, but they can't really diagnose it well. So let's skip down here where it says three types of PPA. So there's three kinds. The semantic PPA is where they slowly lose the ability to understand single words and even recognize objects and people. And this is how it presents, is where they are starting to lose their words. They're not recognizing this is a pen, that is a car, this is the phone, things that they've known their whole lives. They may not recognize or be able to call the name of the object. Agrammatic PPA, progressive non-fluent aphasia, more and more trouble producing speech and even sounds. They will omit connecting words such as to, from, and the, and they may develop some symptoms similar to corticobasal, which is what we're going to look at next. So this is where they can even start losing sounds, because many people with dementia, as the disease progresses, they start to communicate with da 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 da. People who have this type of PPA will even lose the ability to make those sounds. And then a logopenic PPA has trouble finding the words, but they're understanding. So there's a link here between ALS. We're going to talk a little bit about ALS and the link they found that it now falls under that FTD umbrella. So here's the third type, the corticobasal syndrome, which is CBS, and the progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP. PSP presents normally with problems with balance and walking, and behavior problems can develop. One of the things that stands out with this type of frontotemporal disorder is trouble with their eye movement, it particularly being able to look down, and their eyes, it's like their eyes will freeze in different positions. And then CBS, the corticobasal syndrome, typically around the age of 60, and it usually begins with the inability to use their hands or their arms. They can start with a tremor, so again, kind of mimicking or looking like Parkinson's, their arms and legs becoming uncoordinated or stiff. trouble orienting objects in space. You'll see them reach for something and they'll overreach because they're having a hard time with spatial relationships. And then there's other movement disorders that fall under kind of that third type. So a person can have what's called a mixed dementia or a dual diagnosis where they actually have two, like you can have Alzheimer's and vascular. There's frontotemporal dementia with Parkinson, slowed movement problems of Parkinson's with the stiffness, but they have the changes in the behaviors and the language with FTD. So they have both. And then ALS has now moved under again, that dementia umbrella, frontotemporal dementia with ALS. So ALS is a muscle neuron disease, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. And this particular type of frontotemporal disorder is a combination of both diseases. So they will have behaviors with the frontotemporal, and then the muscle weakness, the jerks and the wiggling in the muscles with the ALS. So they have both at the same time. So how to get a diagnosis? An expert evaluation by a doctor that is familiar with these types of disorders. And it can be a neurologist, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist who specializes in frontotemporal disorders. It can be very hard to diagnose. And again, many people are misdiagnosed first go around. So they're going to need neurological exams and they're going to have some brain scans. They normally start with an MRI. And this talks about what are they looking for? They're looking for those changes in the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes. They can see those changes. They may then order a PET scan or a SPECT scan. And I put on there what those, I'm not even going to attempt to read what those stand for, but you've got that information. But what it's looking for is it's measuring blood flow into those areas and glucose usage and oxygen usage. They're going to take a complete record of that person's symptoms, their family history, because again, 40% of the time this was in families. They're going to do a physical exam. They're going to do blood tests to rule out any other conditions because we want to rule out. We've talked about that so many of the dementias, there are things that can mimic some dementias that we want to rule out. So we're going to start at the primary care physician and get all of our blood work done and do a history. Genetic testing, if appropriate, not everybody doesn't do that. And then neuropsych evaluation to assess behavior, language, memory, and other cognitive functions. This is where it's so important that family members are keeping a journal of any behaviors, the time that it happened, the date that it happened, where did it happen, so that you can start seeing a pattern. Treatment and management. What we can do is we can treat the symptoms. This is just like with all of our other dementias, we can treat the symptoms. The good thing with FTD is that we can treat the symptoms. Unlike Lewy body, where with Lewy body, if you treat one, it affects the other. With the frontotemporal disorders, you can treat symptoms with success. You can treat the symptoms. You need a support team. You need those doctors, nurses, and then especially with frontotemporal dementia, that therapy team is going to be huge. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. They're going to go in and out of all three of those throughout the course of this disease. Those therapists know how to tap back into that muscle memory, and they are a huge part of our support team. Managing behaviors, learning early on that we are not going to be reasonable and rational with someone who cannot be reasonable or rational. They would if they could. They can't. We have to accommodate this disease. They can't. Sometimes it takes us, we have to look at that MRI and see that atrophy in the frontal part of the brain for us to understand the damage that's actually going on in their brain. And then medications for symptom management, of course. And finally, it's not easy to live with. It's not easy to live with for the person who has it. It is not easy to live with for those of us that are walking alongside them on this journey. But getting an early and an accurate diagnosis and putting a support team in place is what's crucial. And I found this, it's the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. It has a phone number and it had an email that I found. So you'll have that to get more information. And then also, anybody who gets diagnosed with a frontotemporal disorder, I found this yesterday, because they usually are younger than 65, but they qualify for disability. And from everything I read, and I've talked to people that did not go through the first time, but the majority of people who have this they don't have to apply and apply and apply to get their disability. And then please, 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 if you are a care partner of somebody who has a frontotemporal disorder, to find and join a support group, which we just happen to have here at the West Center, like I mentioned earlier. Good timing. I'm right at 11:30. There's our information. So let me stop sharing the screen and just open it up. I know that was a lot of information very, very fast. You'll get all of this information. You'll get the slides and you will get the recording. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
I have a quick question on, they mentioned glucose usage, how your brain, I mean, that's kind of interesting to me about this insulin resistance and glucose. Do y'all have data on that or information?
One of the things that we do, and Jamie, you may be able to speak more to it, but I know that whenever we're talking about brain health, was it 60%? That our brain uses 60% of all of our glucose. So whenever you even start doing a whole lot of information, you can, if you type in type 3 diabetes, it pulls up Alzheimer's disease. So they're really starting to have some links between glucose and brain health. It's out there, the research is out there. So the good thing about those scans is that they can see the glucose usage in the brain.
Wow, thank you.
It's something. Okay, in the chat, let me see. Oh, thank you for telling me that. It says Social Security disability does not apply to homemakers or people who have not worked a certain number of years. Thank you for sharing that.
I can speak to that a little bit. My husband was self-employed for a number of years, and he did not have enough credits to qualify for disability, even though he was working. So he's 61 and he does not qualify for disability, and you just have to keep applying and see what you can get.
Okay.
Very frustrating.
Yes. And I wonder also, because the article I was reading yesterday, because I got the information for that AFTD, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, was the one that apparently they can help you qualify. So that might be a place to reach out to see if they have a way to go in the back door of Social Security disability. Because I know there seems to always, if we keep at it, many times we can get it. So if they have a frontotemporal disorder, you might contact them and see if they can help you some way.
That's great info.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. If you think of anything later, or if you're interested in any of those other programs that I mentioned earlier, please email me or email Jamie and we'll get that to you and we'll send this out to you later. Thank you. Thanks. We'll see y'all later.